Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM.
Welcome to Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, and on podcasts on Apple, Google, Spotify, and in many other podcast platforms. So please follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook accounts, and subscribe to our podcasts wherever you get your podcasts from. We're always interested in hearing your thoughts, comments. Please leave your comments on those social media feeds. This show is about the Environmental Farm Plan. Never heard of it? Wonder what it is? It is a fascinating story of its development and acceptance by Ontario farmers, and now Canadian farmers. We're broadcasting here from the Treaty Lands of the Mississauga, the Credit First Nation. I'm Paul Smith. I'm the host of a series of shows on farm sustainability here on Food Farm Talk on CFRU. Today we're talking about the Ontario Environmental Farm Plan, which has now become Canada's Environmental Farm Plan, having spread across the country. The story of the development of the Environmental Farm Plan is a fascinating one. The EFP, as it's called, is a social phenomenon as well, based on consensus building and changing social norms among farmers. Farmers led the development of the Environmental Farm Plan. And delivery and administration of the Environmental Farm Plan remains a farmer-to-farmer delivery model. Yes, there are lots of technical experts involved, but those origins were crucial to the acceptance of the Environmental Farm Plan by as many as 37,000 Ontario farmers. So there's a lot of sociology and social marketing behind this model. There's also a lot of agronomy, environmental science, law, and engineering rolled up into the Environmental Farm Plan. So let's start by answering the question, what is an Environmental Farm Plan? We'll hear from Margaret May, who runs Environmental Farm Plan workshops, and from Andrew Campbell, a dairy farmer from near Strathroy.
The Environmental Farm Plan was introduced in 1993. Since then, more than 35,000 Ontario farmers have participated in the program that promotes environmentally sustainable practices. Environmental Farm Plan workshops are organized and delivered locally by the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association. Workshop leader Margaret May explains why the workshops are an important first step in the process of developing and implementing a successful plan for your farm.
Workshop allows primary producers to work their way through a workbook, assess their business against a set of best management practices, learn about legislation, identify potentials for environmental risk within your business, and then move forward and draft action plans to help mitigate those risks. You also have an opportunity to share your situation and learn from the other participants in the room, so it's a win-win for everybody.
During the two-day workshop, May helps farmers work through the Environmental Farm Plan workbook. Through this process, participants assess their farm's strengths and identify areas of concern in up to 23 different areas on their farm. May also reviews the workbooks to offer suggestions and ensure all requirements are addressed.
The workbook deals with fuel, wells, pesticides, fertilizer, soil management, pest management, manure management, natural areas on your farm, so everything. Once you work your way through that book and develop your action plan, then it's handed in to me as the workshop leader for review. It's confidential, it's anonymous, and I don't take any data off that plan. It's returned to the farmer at the end of the process, and then that's the time for them to take action and implement their plan.
Andrew Campbell milks 60 cows with his family on their dairy farm near Strathroy, Ontario. He says the workshop process really helps farmers understand how they can impact the environment.
So I took my first EFP workshop about 5 years ago. It was the time that I was coming home to farm and thought it was an important thing to have. And so certainly, in that workshop, it was one of those, eye-openers in terms of, little things you can do to have a big impact. So we always looked after those big picture things. We tried to avoid, big manure spills, but to be able to look at little things like just barnyard runoff or fuel spills and managing them and things like that was something that we thought was pretty important out of that workshop.
Manure management is a big part of Campbell's environmental farm plan. Part of his action plan included a new manure pit required for the expanding dairy farm. He's also working to implement many smaller improvements he identified during his workshop.
It's obviously really important that we all look after the environment we're around, and we all want to do that, but to get some real examples, I think, was one of the big things we took out of that. I mean, yes, it's a 2-day workshop, but it's 2 days that lasts for, 5 years. And it does give you some really great takeaways and maybe things around the farm that you didn't think about that you can make improvements on. And then obviously if you are making some improvements, there's probably a bit of funding there to help. So all of a sudden, that 2 days of workshop pays back pretty quickly if that funding comes through.
So that gave you a bit of a thumbnail description of the environmental farm plan and a farmer's perspective on it. Now let's dig into the history, results, and future of the environmental farm plan with Andy Graham. You may recall in previous episodes we talked about how the environmental farm plan could eventually form the basis of voluntary sustainability certification for Ontario farms. So I'm here with Andy Graham, who's the Executive Director of the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association. And we're going to be talking about environmental farm plan for a while here. Andy's been immersed in that for quite a long time. Andy, maybe you can just introduce yourself a little bit and who the Soil and Crop Improvement Association is.
Sure. Ontario Soil and Crop is a rather unique farm organization in Ontario. We've been around since 1939 is when we first formed. At that time, as a group of interested farmers based at the county or district level who had similar interests in crop management and development of new cropping practices. That side of the organization continues to this day. We have more than 50 local organizations out there at the county level. We're speaking here in Wellington County. There's a Wellington Soil and Crop. Major business of the association since the late 80s has been in stewardship program delivery.
So maybe you can tell our audience a bit about what an environmental farm plan is, so what's included in that. And
well, the environmental farm plan has an interesting history. It all started back in the early 90s. Actually in response to the provincial government of the day who determined they were going to take another look at policies affecting agriculture, and the perceived threat in the farm community is that they were going to play a larger hand in determining what was normal farm practice and where things would have to change. That news wasn't received well by a number of farm organizations, general farm organizations, sector groups, and others. So they got together and formed the Ontario Farm Environmental Coalition. The Environmental Farm Plan effort grew out of that commitment and rolled out on a pilot basis in 92-93, and then became a full-fledged program that we are still delivering through Ontario Soil and Crop province-wide. And it has become a marquee program for Ontario agriculture, and we're extremely proud of what has been accomplished. In terms of the process itself, it is voluntary. It starts with the farmer, the farm business, signing up for a workshop. Some will come into those workshops thinking that they can maybe get away with just doing 3 or 4 worksheets. But once they get into the exercise and recognize it's not threatening, it's delivered in a workshop with their peers, it's being delivered through Ontario Soil and Crop. Some people are then comfortable enough to let their guard down and really accept the exercise for what it is. It's an educational opportunity to be able to identify risk in their own operations and then get a good look at what other people are doing in similar circumstances to overcome those risks. So there's some fantastic discussions that take place at these workshops.
Yeah, that's probably one of the more interesting parts is the interaction between farmers in the workshops and sharing of ideas. It sort of forces the participant to look at their farm objectively, right, and go through the process, right? So you think they find things that they weren't expecting?
Absolutely. I think it verifies some of their activities that they know they're doing a good job on, and that validation is important, right? We all want to hear about what we're doing well, but it also very effectively identifies maybe some of the soft spots in one's management plan, areas of risk that they may have known about but hadn't given much priority. And maybe they go out of the workshops learning that they need to give it much more attention because some of these are fairly large issues when when society starts putting focus on Lake Erie water quality, for example.
What did individual farmers think about the idea of doing an environmental farm plan at that point? And then obviously that's 25 plus years ago. How would you say sort of thinking of individual farmers has changed over that time period in terms of this?
Well, not surprisingly, when the Ontario Farm Environmental Coalition announced that they would be working towards development of an environmental farm plan, and at that point invited Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, as well as Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada to be part of the development process. Anytime you are asking someone, it doesn't matter whether you're in the farm community or not, to go through a self-assessment which potentially is identifying practices which are not only ill-advised but may be out of compliance with current regulation, and you're asking someone to write it down, acknowledge it, and commit to an action plan that identifies what they're going to do in response and when it's going to be done. Not surprisingly, there are a percentage of people in the audience who are apprehensive. Is this ever going to be used against me? And it did take a lot of effort in those early years to get a toehold. There were some that recognized right out of the gate the value of environmental farm plan and were the early ones to jump right on it. We are very proud to say that after all these years, we have never had a breach of confidentiality. We're very proud of that.
But I think, how has it changed perception? Because I don't think perception is like that anymore now. It's become more accepted as a tool that people can use, right?
Fair enough. In the early days, we knew when we were doing our scan of similar initiatives elsewhere in the globe, we knew that there would be an advantage to attach some kind of financial incentive to the effort. And in the very early days, that incentive was $500 that was coming through the government partners. Before long, that was elevated to $1,500. And that could be used towards any item that had been identified in a verified action plan.
Yeah, it was just a cost share, it wasn't a gift.
It wasn't a gift.
No.
You had to take action, you had to spend money, but up to $1,500 would be reimbursed.
Right.
Today, and in some of the years since, when there was a tendency to number one, to escalate the amount of COSHA that was available in the farm community for the adoption of these best practices. And the programs at times were offering $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, as high as $90,000.
Well, those are also for substantial investments on the part of the
Substantial
farmers.
investments, and ones like that 90,000 that goes back a few years, that was actually stacking some provincially available money on top of some federally available money. But nevertheless, the point is, there was a huge incentive to participate in environmental farm plan. It was because you needed the farm plan as one of the entry tickets into the incentive programs. And the incentive programs were no longer $1,500, but $50,000 and more. That changes the optics as to why one would participate in an environmental farm plan workshop. And we have been challenged with that change ever since, and we have to stay true to the original principles, that this is an adult education tool to try and influence the thinking when it comes to the adoption of best practices.
Right. But it remains that, but you're adding the element of the incentive, financial incentive, so you're combining strategies or tactics to get behavior change.
Yeah. So, being here at Soil and Crop throughout the life of environmental farm plan, so I was part of those early days. I saw the changes that we've been talking about and the different challenges in keeping the environmental farm plan fresh over all those years. You do that through new additions, but you also have to pay attention to how it's promoted. We are now into what appears to be a very promising electronic edition of the environmental farm plan. We, of course, weren't thinking of that at all back in the early 90s, but we are certainly...
Before the internet.
Before the internet. But we are, we're there now, and we've just, we had an electronic version for the last number of years, but participation levels were quite low. As you know, Paul, there's a lot of, when one first arrives at those shops, there's some fairly important work to do with identifying soil types on each individual's farm, and there's a tremendous amount of resources that support that activity, and it has been challenging to simplify that process in the electronic version and still provide the necessary resources to do an accurate assessment of things like soil resources. We're getting better as the years go by, and the version we have right now, I understand, is quite good.
So we talked about the origins of the environmental farm plan here in Ontario back in the 90s, but then in the last decade or more, it's spread across the entire country now. So that's a big success. And I know you've been involved in various aspects of that.
Well, shortly after it got a promising hold in the Ontario countryside, some of the farm groups out in Atlantic Canada took notice and came to Ontario and spent some time with us to better understand the EFP, and took all that information home and developed their own environmental farm plan, largely based on the Ontario product, but adjusted appropriately for conditions in Atlantic Canada. And a few years later, which would take it into the late 90s, leading up to 2000, we were working with another group out in Alberta who wanted to introduce environmental farm plan into their farm community. Back in, I guess, about 2005, in response to a federal provincial program that was introduced at the time, the federal government established that there would be environmental farm plans developed coast to coast. That spearheaded some of the provinces that had been maybe holding back a little bit, were more or less required to move forward with their own environmental farm plan if they wanted to take advantage of some of the program opportunities that were available at the time through I've tried to reiterate in this conversation that here in Ontario, it started with the farm organizations. The government groups were invited to the table once the farm groups had all rallied behind this idea of developing an EFP. In some of the other provinces, who were basically told, if you want to take advantage of programming, you need to have an environmental farm plan, and here's your deadline to make that happen. In those situations, my understanding was guided a lot more by government. And it was interesting to see eventually when that was rolled out to the farm community, the response in the farm community, because it was a little different situation. The farm community wasn't there at the table helping to build it. It was built by very skilled and knowledgeable folks in the provincial government, but they then had to convince people in the farm organizations that this was a good thing.
Yeah.
Having done it, if we ever had the chance to do it all again, I wouldn't change a thing in how Ontario chose their strategy. It was a much better scenario than the community.
So you think that consensus building approach paid off in terms of the acceptance in the countryside and by individual farmers being more accepting because the farm organizations were directly involved and instigators?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that rapid acceptance in between 93 and about 2000, in terms of, I mentioned earlier, a very high percentage of farmers participating voluntarily for that, had an awful lot to do with what you're talking about in terms of the willingness of people to step forward because they've heard from enough people within their own organizations that they are members of, as well as others, that this is a good thing to do, and it's the right thing to do.
And farmer-led.
Farmer-led, critically important. Right at the moment, and are very comfortable in suggesting more than 70% of the farm community has participated at least once in the environmental farm plan workshop in the farm community.
So yeah, it's interesting, this is kind of where the results come in, right? It all depends on participation, the amount of action you get on the ground. And so it's interesting to talk about the 70% because I know that's been around for a while. But then Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and Statistics Canada have done the survey every 4 years associated with the census, where they estimate the participation, at least in 2016, was 46% of farmers had an environmental farm plan. That was up from 2011, which was when they had 38, and they do this nationally. So whether it's 70 or 48, those are still pretty good numbers for a voluntary program. But is there do you think there's any conflict between those two versions of the numbers, or is there different methodology?
I will certainly stand behind the numbers that we have been collecting here at Soil and Crop, because we've been the ones that have been delivering all those workshops over all those years. Now we do have to be very careful on how we use the numbers, because
you have retirements, people retire and sell the farm and so on too, right?
And we also have a lot of farms that have stayed within the same family, and we're now easily with the second generation away from the individual who may have participated.
Well, the other part of implementation is, as we've talked about before, is work that was done back in 2011 by Prairie Research Associates, where looked at participants in the EAP and what they had implemented from the plan. As you described, the action plan that each producer has to put together, and then they have to go out and implement it. So, and then the question really is, and this is a question with lots of these kind of programs, is how much of it the work actually gets done.
Right.
And so that revealed that about 68% of the actions identified had been done at that point in time.
Which was tremendous.
Yeah.
Tremendous numbers. Now, and you're right, when Ontario Soil and Crop has been the delivery agent for the EFP workshops, but throughout those years, we have also been the delivery agent chosen for many of the incentive programs. And we have considerable data here on every project that has been funded with assistance, or shall I say, every incentive program that has been rolled out in association with Environmental Farm Plan. And we can track all those various projects according to category and total cost of the project and what the farmer brought to the table and so on and so forth. But you're right, we only have statistics on the projects where an incentive payment was involved. And what
Well, that's
became...
still quite substantial in numbers of projects and
It's absolutely,
investment.
it's absolutely substantial. It's we've got numbers here from about the last 20 years indicating we're approaching about 40,000 projects representing hundreds of millions of dollars in total investment on the farm. It's astounding the amount of work that's been done, but in fact that only represents a portion of the actual amount of work, management changes that have taken place, new projects that have been adopted in response to the education that was acquired in part through the Environmental Farm Plan Workshop. And that was the work of the...
You think there's a bit of a sort of culture of stewardship that's come out of this and a sort of peer pressure on this?
It has absolutely strengthened the ethic out there, and it sure puts a very positive lens on agriculture.
So, the Environmental Farm Plan is not particularly well known outside the farm community, and what would you say to consumers and the average urbanite as to how Environmental Farm Plan has been doing a good job in terms of protecting the environment, improving and reducing environmental risks on Ontario farms generally?
Good question. I agree. We've done a pretty good job over the years of parlaying the message about Environmental Farm Plan in the farm community. We have not done so well in sharing the many accomplishments associated with environmental farm planning and the resulting actions outside of the farm community.
And in a sense, focusing on results, on the ground results, rather than on communications is probably, that's a good sign that the effort is going in the right direction, rather than trying to say what a good job you're doing. You're trying to do the good job, rather than just... And hopefully, doing things like this through you and podcasts, we can try to spread the word a little bit more about the substance of what's been accomplished through Environmental Farm Plan and all the associated projects that go along with that.
I'm always intrigued when I visit on-farm, farm gate markets, this type of thing. Wineries down in Niagara, visiting some of them, and I'm intrigued when they have the Environmental Farm Plan sign right there in their storefront. Mm-hmm. And I ask, why? Are they using it from a marketing standpoint? And I've had many people over the years absolutely convinced that having that sign up at the end of the lane for their farm gate sales or in the storefront of those wineries, it is making a difference. Mm-hmm. They're very proud of their involvement in the Environmental Farm Plan, and it starts a conversation. It gets people asking, what is that? We have to continue to look at ways we can take it much further. So all of Ontario agriculture is benefiting from the stellar reputation that has been gained through the Environmental Farm Plan. And that in turn will help us get to that small percentage who has not yet participated in Environmental Farm Plan. With a voluntary initiative like this, there's always going to be a percentage that holds back for whatever reason. We have to better understand what those reasons are and do what we can to invite them willingly into the voluntary program.
Well, that's probably a good point to end the discussion about Environmental Farm Plan. Thanks, Andy, for discussing this with us. So today you've heard a lot about the Environmental Farm Plan, and perhaps you've learned what on earth it is for the first time. And you've learned something about the evolution of the Environmental Farm Plan among Ontario and Canadian farmers. And you may have observations about what you've heard. So please put those comments on our Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter social media feeds. We want to stimulate discussion and informed debate. Thanks a lot to Andy Graham, Margaret May, and Andrew Campbell for their contributions to the show. Please tune in to the next Food Farm Talk on CFRU 93.3 FM in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, and on podcast on all the major platforms. Thanks for listening.